Hi, room 15. It is Tuesday, May 26th, 2020. So we are continuing our fractions unit. Today we're going to continue to partition shapes into halves, thirds, and fourths. Our learning targets are we can partition circles and rectangles into equal parts. And then we can describe equal parts as halves, thirds, and fourths. So let's review what partitioning means. The word partition means to divide or break one whole shape into equal parts. So here are my shapes, and here you can see that I have partitioned them into 4 equal parts. Remember, you can also call parts shares. So look at these shapes. I have a rectangle, a square, and a circle. Today we're just going to be looking at rectangles and circles, but you can also partition squares. So we can draw lines to partition or divide them into equal parts. Remember, you can also call equal parts equal shares. So here we can divide these or partition them into fourths, which we'll be doing later. So we are going to review what halves, thirds, and fourths are. Last lesson, we just looked at whole shapes and we partitioned them into halves. Today, we're going to be partitioning shapes into thirds and fourths. So remember, halves means there are 2 equal parts, and this is one way I can partition a shape. Thirds, I have 3 equal parts. That's one way. And then fourths, I have my lines. That's one way to partition them into 4 equal parts. So we'll be looking at different ways to partition a rectangle. But here for the thirds, I have vertical lines. And then the fourths, I have vertical and horizontal lines. So last week we worked with halves. Today, let's take a look at thirds. So when something is divided into thirds, how many equal shares does it have, or how many equal parts? Remember, equal shares is another way to describe equal parts. So if we partition a shape in thirds, there are 3 equal shares or 3 equal parts. Kind of like the picture like here. So if you take a look at that circle, it sort of looks like a peace sign. We'll be talking about, and I'll be showing you how to partition a circle into thirds. Okay, and then we have rectangle. That's one way to partition a shape into thirds. And as you can see, I have one part shaded. We're also going to be discussing and focusing on how to shade the parts in a whole shape today. Sorry about that. So then if we partition a shape into fourths, there are 4 equal shares or 4 equal parts. Same thing, but if fourths is 4 parts, thirds is 3 parts. And then these are all rectangles, and these are all different ways to partition a shape into fourths if you have a rectangle. So the first one shows vertical lines, and then that's one way to do it. The second rectangle is all horizontal lines, and then the last rectangle is a horizontal and a vertical line. And all of these shapes show 1 part shaded and 3 parts unshaded. If you remember last week, we talked about the difference between shaded and unshaded. So unshaded are just the parts that are not shaded. So what's the difference between halves and thirds? So last week we learned about halves, so what's the difference? So look at the shapes partitioned into halves and thirds. So here I have 2 rectangles. One is partitioned into thirds and one's partitioned into halves. And then I have 2 circles. One showing halves, one showing thirds. So what is the difference between halves and thirds? Well, look at each part. Are the halves larger or are the thirds larger? So let's just focus on the shaded part on the halves. So take a look. And then let's compare the halves to the thirds. Which one is larger? Just look at the rectangles right now. Which part is larger? Is the part that's shaded in the halves larger, or is the part shaded in the thirds larger? And then same with the circle. Is the part that is 1/2 larger, or is the part that is 1/3 larger? So the halves is larger, okay? And let's talk about why. Halves are always larger than thirds because the whole shape is divided less times. So let's take a look at the rectangle, okay? Here we have two rectangles that are the same exact length, okay? And then this half is larger than 1/3 because I'm only dividing it 2 times. But in this rectangle, I have 3 equal parts, which means each part is going to be smaller, okay? So that's why halves are always larger than thirds, because the whole shape is being divided into less parts. So each part is larger, if that makes sense. Same with the circles. The circles are the same exact size. And here I have a 1/2, and here I have 1/3. I only have 2 parts here, so each part is going to be larger than each third. Because here I have 3 parts. Here I'm only partitioning the circle into 2 parts. Okay, so halves will always be larger. Okay. Now, let's take a look at some shapes to practice partitioning the shapes into thirds and fourths, which you're going to be doing today. Okay, so this is, okay, my friends, so we're going to look at some rectangles and circles here, and I'm going to be partitioning them into thirds and fourths. So let's just first start with thirds. Okay, because you're going to have to partition them into thirds. When you're doing this, you want to make sure that you try your best to make sure that each part is the same size and shape. Okay, because remember, when you're partitioning, you need to make sure that they are equal shares or equal parts. And if they're equal, that means they're the same size and the same shape. So here, my first rectangle, I'm going to use vertical lines. I'm just going to try my best and to draw vertical lines. So here I have thirds. And then if I'm going to be shading it in, this would be 1/3. Okay. So this is 1/3. Okay. I can do the same thing here. I'm going to try my best to do the same exact thing. And then this time I'm going to shade in 2 parts. So this would actually 2/3. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this rectangle. I'm still partitioning into thirds. Just try my best to make sure that they're equal. Okay. Like, for example, if I did this would definitely not be equal. And the reason why is because this part right here is way larger than these 2 parts. Okay. But my other shapes, I'm trying my best to make sure that they're equal. Okay. And then if I shade in the whole thing, there's actually 2 ways to describe this last rectangle when I shade it. We could say that this is 3/3 because it's 3 parts out of 3 total parts that are shaded. So that'd be 3/3. Or I could say 1 whole because the whole thing's shaded. Okay. Now I'm going to partition my rectangles into thirds still. This time I'm going to use horizontal lines. This time it's a little more trickier if you're doing horizontal lines, especially if you're on the iPad like I am. But if you're or if you're doing it on Seesaw, and I would definitely suggest if you're using a paper and a pencil to use a ruler. A ruler is a great way. It's a little bit better. And then if I shade 1 part, remember that would be 1/3. And then I'm going to do it again. Try my best just to draw the line straight and to make sure my parts are equal. Just trying your best. And then if I have 2 parts shaded, this would be 2/3. Okay. And then my last one, once again, making sure that they're equal. And then if I shade the whole thing, this is 3/3. Okay. And then let's take a look at the circles. Okay. Now the circles are tricky. Okay. Especially when you're doing thirds. Fourths is much easier. Thirds, you're always going to go kind of like a pizza, like that, okay? And then if I shade one part, it's 1/3, 2 parts, 2/3, 3 parts, 3/3, or 1 whole, okay? Now, let me just clear this page because now we're going to look at fourths, okay? So I'm going to use the same shapes. So now I'm going to use the same shapes and I'm going to partition them into fourths this time. Okay, so I can use vertical lines. So if you're going to do vertical lines, I suggest you partition it into half and then you do each half. And then you can see that there are fourths, okay? Let me try that again. Oops, let me try that again. So you want to do half and then just trying your best to make sure they're equal. If I have one part, this would actually be 1/4. Okay. If I do it again and I shade 2 parts, this would be 2/4. Okay. This time I'm going to show you actually horizontal lines. Just really try my best to make it equal. It's much easier to do it on paper. This is one way to do it. If I do 3 parts, which is kind of hard to see, but this would be 3/4. And then the last way, you can do it like this with horizontal and vertical lines. And then if I shade in all 4 parts, this is 4/4. Or another way to write it is 1 whole. Okay? Now, let's take a look at the circles. For the circles, I can use, oops, let me try to make that straight. I can use a cross like that, horizontal and vertical, or I can even go like that, okay? And then if I shade in one part, this would be 1/3, 2 parts. Take a look at this. So this is 2/4, but if you notice, you can also see that it is 1/2. So 2/4 also equals 1/2. Okay? So if you shade in 2/4, it can also mean 1/2 because half of the shape is shaded. Okay? Now, let's take a look at how to write these fractions. Okay? So 1/3, you would write it like this because it's 1 part out of 3 total parts. That's how you read a fraction. 2/3 would look like this. 3/3 would look like this, or you could write just 1 whole. Okay? For fourths, it'd be 1/4, 2/4, or 1/2, like we just said. 3/4, and then 4/4, or 1 whole, which we've learned in number corner before, right? Okay, so let's take a look at what you're going to be doing today. Okay, so you're going to have to partition shapes, and then you need to look at if the shapes are equal. Are they showing halves or thirds? So you're going to do the shapes below show halves or thirds. So I see that there are 2 equal parts, so I see halves. Okay? Draw 1 more line to partition each shape above into fourths. So remember, you're just drawing 1 more line. So here, and you want to make sure that each part is equal. So I'm just going to go across like that to make fourths. Okay? And then Number 2, partition each rectangle into thirds. So now you need to pay attention to this part because this is the part that's telling you after you partition the shapes, then it says to shade the shapes as indicated. This word means indicated, means like as told. Okay? So I'm going to partition them into thirds. I'm actually just going to use horizontal lines. Oops, I meant vertical lines. I always get those two mixed up. I don't know about you guys. So I'm going to use vertical lines because they're just a little bit easier than those horizontal lines. Okay, and then I'm going to shade in 2/3, which means I need to shade in 2 parts. 1/3, I'm going to shade in 1 part. Oops, sorry, my friends. And then 3/3, the whole thing. Okay, number 3, partitioning circle into fourths. So I'm just going to, let me use the other one, the other tool. I'm going to use these crosses because it's just so much easier. And then once again, after you draw the lines to partition each circle into fourths, you're going to shade the shapes as indicated. Remember, this word means indicated is like as told or as stated. So 1/4 is 1 part. 3/4, I'm going to draw shade in 3 parts. 4/4, 1 whole. Remember, 4/4 is always another way to say 1 whole. And then 2/4 also is another way to say 1/2. So I want to show you those fractions, okay? So let's go back to the thirds. This would be 2/3 like this. 1/3, that's how you write that fraction. And then 3/3, or you could just write 1 whole. For the fourths, it's 1/4, 3/4. Oh, that doesn't look like a 3. Let me fix that. 4/4 or 1 whole, and then 2/4, or do you remember what else you could write? 1/2. Okay, my friends, let's go to the next page. Partition and shade the following shapes. Each rectangle or circle is 1 whole. Okay, so you have to pay attention to what it's saying. 1/2. Half means I need 2 parts. Oh, that's not equal. You gotta make sure it's always equal. And then 1/2. So I'm shading in 1/2. Okay. You really have to pay attention to what it says to know first how many parts you need to have, and then second, how many parts should be shaded. Okay, so I'm going to be shading 1/4. So I need 4 parts. Oh, that's not my best, but I'm just gonna try to draw that line. And then 1/4. So I'm only shading in 1 part. Thirds. I'm gonna try to use these vertical lines. And then it's 1/3. So only 1 part shaded. 2/4. Okay, so now we're not shading in 1 part anymore. So I need to shade in 2 parts. Okay. Halves. And then it says 2 halves. So it's 1/2, 2 halves, or 1 whole. Okay. So 2/3. So first I need to partition into thirds, and then I'm shading 2 of the parts because it says 2/3. Okay, so if you're not sure, write out the fraction, and this is how many parts you would shade. Same with this. 2 halves, this is how many you would shade. 2/4, this is how many you're shading in. Okay. 3/3. I'll write out that fraction. This is how many parts I need to shade in. So 3 of them, all of it. 3/4. This is how you write that fraction. This is how many parts you're shading. So I need to shade in 3 parts. And then this is the tricky part. 3 halves. I have 2 shapes, okay? It says halves. So that means that each shape needs to be partitioned into halves. And then I'm shading in 3 of them. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to change my tool. 3 halves. Okay. This is 3rd or even 4th grade work, my friends. Okay. Good job. So this last part we're going to skip because we are not having you do that problem. Okay. Now, let me show you what you're going to be doing today. Okay. So you are going to be working on fractions, partition shapes into equal parts. So you are going to be, remember, this is like a reminder sheet. Halves equal 2 equal parts. Thirds equal 3 equal parts. fourths equal equal parts. And the partition means to divide into equal parts. So you're going to be doing the same thing that I just did. You need to please make sure you read these directions on the side. It's just another way to remind you what you're supposed to use. I would use this pencil tool to help you partition or draw. And then I would use the highlighter tool to shade in the parts, okay? So you're basically doing the same exact thing I just showed you. Question 1, you need to write if it's showing halves or thirds. You're going to draw one more line to show fourths. And then number 2, you are partitioning each rectangle into thirds. And then you need to take a look at here to know what to shade in. Same with question number 3, okay? You're going to be partitioning the shapes into fourths using the pencil tool. And then you need to pay attention to what it says below it to know how many parts to shade, okay? Page 3, number 4. You're going to partition the shapes, and then you're going to shade it as it says. So you got to really pay attention to what it says above the shape. Okay, use the pencil tool to partition the shapes, and then use the highlighter tool to shade it in. This last question, remember, it says halves. I'm just going to help you out here. You want to make sure that these are partitioned into halves, and then you are shading in 3 of them. Okay, my friends, then you're going to click the check when you are done. Good luck.